Hello, everyone. The goal of today is to introduce you to Chapter 22 and give you an overview. I'm going to be as concise as possible while still trying to introduce you to all the topics in this chapter. And the way the format of this is going to work is we're going to try and connect all these social history trends to your prior knowledge. Because if you think about Chapter 22 in the complete whole picture sense, all it's really doing is giving you this update on how governments and societies were adjusting and adapting to all of these issues that were coming about over the course of the Industrial Revolution in this very tumultuous political age. So we've got to review some of those issues from chapters 20 and 21, and then we'll give you the update. So here's how this is going to work. There's really four issues that we could break down into multiple parts that we've seen across chapters 20 and 21. And the first, of course, is living and working conditions because of the rapid move to the cities for those factory jobs. The second is public health, or the conditions of those cities and the diseases that emerged. We have to get a little bit more background into that, but you can, I'm sure, imagine the situation that was occurring. The third is class and social structure. So we've looked at the fracturing of social classes and the creation of new social classes that don't quite know how to be represented or where they fit in society. So we have to talk about that. And that leads to a related issue of new family norms and how families adjusted to the separation of labor and new values of the city, the challenging vices that they encountered in the city. So those are our four major issues. We can really group them together. 1 and 2 very much go together about the environment of living, and 3 and 4 go together about class and values and things like that. But we'll treat them separately. We'll review each issue, and then we'll get into the new stuff at Chapter 22 and how those issues were addressed or how society coped. And there's one last topic in Chapter 22 that we have to treat separately, which is new cultural and intellectual trends. So how did both scientific thinking but also literature and art respond to those new social changes? All right, so that's how we're going to get into this. So let's start with number 1. So issue number 1, I think we've worked with this one a lot. The Manchester DBQ reminds me of issue number 1 a lot. But as Europe industrialized, obviously it becomes much more urban, and that becomes an overcrowding issue. So if we just look at this map from Chapter 22, it shows you really quickly the growth of large cities. So by 1850, but certainly by 1890, 1900, Europe is a very, very urban place. And just to contrast that with the United States, most Americans aren't living in cities until the 1920s in the US, so Europe industrializes and urbanizes faster than the United States. So the United States could look to Europe for models of how to cope with these urban issues because they had to figure it out first. Clearly, our cities like London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, Constantinople, St. Petersburg, those are large and continue to get larger. But look at how many more green dots we have of people living in cities of 100,000 or more, which by modern standards isn't huge, but by 19th century standards, that's a pretty sizable city. And they're also much more densely located in Northern Europe. And of course, Britain becomes a very urbanized place. A big problem with these cities is obviously congestion. So to put it in context, cities were never clean or uncongested places, and we're constantly reminded that life on the farm was also quite dirty and congested, but we're just exacerbating that problem when you get so many people living together. Cities were always walking cities. There was never any idea that you should provide transportation. But as cities grow really, really large, it simply becomes impossible to live your daily life. You couldn't go to work and also acquire food and get kids all in one day. It just took so long to get around because there's no public services happening. So they literally became non-functioning. You kind of have to imagine this is like if everybody's school schedule changed on the same day and they didn't know where they were going class to class, kind of like the first week of school. The congestion is so bad, it gets hard to even make it to class on time. So that's kind of a small metaphor I would use for the way things worked in the cities. And obviously, this leads to bigger issues that are going to get into number two, which is public health. So, cities are really, really dirty, and housing quality is really poor. There's no regulation for zoning or for housing quality. So, it's literally the city is killing people. You're much more likely to have a shortened life living in the city than outside the city. Here's probably the most famous image of this from a British magazine, Punch magazine. A court for King Cholera. We're going to talk about cholera in a second. But you see the filth of the city and the people literally playing around in that filth. This pile you see in the lower left is not trash, it's human excrement. And yes, that is a small child doing a somersault down that hill and an old woman looking for food. So this is bad news all around. So of course, this requires a lot of reforms in both urban planning and public transportation. We're going to deal with the reforms for health separately after we talk about the public health issues. The best example we have of urban reform, and it's a very dramatic reform, and if you've ever been to Paris or get to go to Paris, you see the positive benefits of this reform all around you. So the best case example we have is how Paris modernized in the 1870s. The emperor at the time, Napoleon III, we'll talk about how that becomes an empire later, he hires this guy, George Haussmann, to just treat the city in a kind of very French utopian socialist view as this place that needed major overhauling, really disregarding where people lived and why they lived there to make the city a functioning city. So if we look at this map, we can see the extent to which the city was expanded and also revamped. So it grows in size a lot, obviously, between 1860 and in the 1870s when he's doing this. They tear down all the old walls. And some other things that they're doing is they're making space for very wide boulevards. And I know this map doesn't seem all that tidy by American standards because American cities tend to be grids. They actually organize the streets a lot better. And very importantly, they create places for public parks. And that's important because we're going to look more at class structure and how people like to spend their leisure time. So the cities are becoming a beautiful, enjoyable place to be. And that was one of the major motivations for the emperor at the time, was to make Paris a city that was glorified, to glorify France as a whole. So here's a picture of Paris from the 1870s, right before they started revamping the city. And you could see that how working classes lived was they sort of just built homes as needed. And that creates a big issue with slums, of course. But there's no paved streets, so there's kind of this hazy division between city and country. And these are not the healthiest places for people to live. You also have very narrow streets. So here's an example of a pretty narrow street. And all of Paris would have looked like this. You see in the distance that they're starting to tear up those streets and build wider boulevards. And Haussmann was charged to do this, again, with very little regard for where people were living. So, of course, what he started to do was tear down those slums and that working class housing to make room for a much more middle class lifestyle, which was a problem for the working class, but very much benefited the middle class. And we'll see that's kind of a trend through the whole chapter, is the glorification of the middle class. Here's a great picture of the boulevards that are created, and this gives you a better sense of some of the order to the city than that map did. So you have many cities that are modeled on Haussmann's plan, which are radial, wide boulevards that radiate from major city centers. So, for example, from the Arc de Triomphe. And these would be the major arteries of the city. Obviously, at this point, we have automobiles. But these would be the major thoroughfares of trade and commerce. And then, of course, there'd be smaller streets and side streets for where people lived to give people a sense of neighborhood. But it became much better for getting around, for getting to work, for getting shopping done. And speaking of shopping, a big push for Haussmann was to build not only boulevards, but also to change the way buildings looked. So this is another great example of Haussmann's style apartments. And Paris is very uniform in that style of architecture, which gives the city a very beautiful quality because of its uniform time period and its uniform look. And there's also a lot of building of music halls, operas, government buildings, museums. So all these things that make the city an enjoyable place to live and also glorify the city and attract tourism to the city so other people come and not only think the city is beautiful, but think very positively about the French government. We have a lot of paintings of Paris being done at the time that also glorify it. So here's probably a more accurate 19th century depiction of the city, but you still get a sense of the wide boulevards. And off in the distance in the very back is the Opera House of Paris. You also see them building fountains or pretty public spaces where people would gather and socialize because more middle class people have the leisure time to do that. And you'll also see here that we really have mostly horse and carriage transportation. There might be a hazy streetcar in there, but let's talk about that. So we've talked about zoning and public spaces. We're going to talk more about water and waste disposal in a bit when we get to the second issue, actually. And so probably number 4 is probably the most important thing that revolutionized cities, which is an American invention, the electric streetcar, and just electricity in general. So here's another image of Paris where we see electricity benefiting life in the city. And then here's a painting of Madrid from around 1900. And you see they're living this sort of hybrid life where they still have carriages drawn by horses, but the electric streetcar was really important. And it had really positive effects, but something that we'll have to cope with is it expands the city, so it creates more space, less crowding. It opens up housing for the middle class, and what we really start to see is neighborhoods that are divided by class, which is somewhat problematic. Okay, so we've talked about issue 2 a little bit already, so we go through it quickly. And issue 2 is obviously a public health major concern. And there's really only one major concern here, which is infectious disease. And of course, it's a problem because scientists aren't really sure how infectious diseases spread yet. The theory that was dominant at the time was miasmatic theory, which is basically just you acquire diseases through bad air, which we know can be true of some diseases. But not really helpful for combating many of the diseases that these cities were dealing with, like cholera, typhus, typhoid, the flu was a big problem. So they started to get a hunch that there are other things besides bad air causing infectious disease. And so here's an example of a developed understanding of what clean water could do. So as they develop a better understanding of disease transmission, besides air, like bacteria that can live in water, for example, you start to get major health reforms. So of course, that leads to a massive reform movement known as the public health movement. The public health movement really emerges with this British guy, Edwin Chadwick, who is charged by the British government with the passage of the Poor Laws of 1834, these laws that are designed to understand the causes of poverty. And he's a utilitarian. He's very influenced by Jeremy Bentham, that the government should do the greatest good for the greatest number. And what he basically proposes is that disease is the major cause of poverty, which of course it absolutely is a major contributor to poverty. When people are sick or they're taking care of sick children, they're not working, they can't work, and we don't have a situation with labor laws at the time that allows them to maintain their jobs. So people are constantly losing their jobs or losing a family wage because of the prevalence of disease. So Chadwick has a major influence on encouraging government to fund the study of disease. And in particular, he influences this man, John Snow, who wants to study the cholera outbreak called the Broad Street cholera epidemic. And you see the map of that John Snow created in the lower right. And what John Snow definitely proves is that it's water that's bringing cholera to the cities. So the government decides, without very much debate, that they need to start providing sewage systems and clean water and drainage and toilets and all that stuff. This guy probably has the biggest impact on this entire age, Louis Pasteur. And he basically is the man we attribute with modern germ theory, the theory that replaces miasmatic theory about how diseases are spread. So there's this bacterial revolution that comes about where people start to really research specific bacterias. But Louis Pasteur is the guy we associate with the whole concept of germ theory. But some of his colleagues, a lot of his German colleagues like Robert Koch, start looking at specific bacteria and how to kill them. And then you have this guy Lister who understands antiseptics, how do we kill bacteria. So this is making hospitals a lot safer as well, but the general city environment. And then what do you know? We get this major decline in death rates after this bacterial revolution. And that occurs pretty much everywhere. So death rates, of course, we know are one of the major contributors to population explosions. So we'll have to look at how population was controlled in a little bit. All right, issue number 3 is class and social structure. We've seen a lot of evidence across chapters 20 and 21 of how a more diverse social hierarchy is causing some issues. So some examples. We've looked at the Luddites, how we have skilled workers who are upset about industrialization and they go around and smash machines. We have a Chartist movement where we have more people of the middling and working classes demanding representation in government, and you can frame that as class warfare as well. So in Britain we have an aristocratic class that wants to maintain political control of the country, and we have rising classes starting to challenge that. And we know that breaks out in something like the Peterloo Massacre. So this resistance to laws like the Corn Laws, which only benefit certain classes over others. So another example of class warfare. And then we've got in France in 1848, we have some pretty literal class warfare that breaks out as they're trying to decide which direction their government is going to go. So class divisions demonstrate or come about in these issues over political representation all the time. After the revolutions of 1848, we aren't going to see violent class warfare really, but we have other ways that society coped with these differences. And this is probably the bulk of this chapter. So these aren't a series of reforms. Government is doing very little to pass laws that work out class issues. I did mention the Poor Law of 1834, and that is a good example of laws that are designed to protect the poorest of the poor and to offer some social assistance to them. But beyond that, they're not doing a whole lot to regulate class interaction. So let's talk about the new social structure and then get into some specifics of each class. This is the golden age of the middle class, so they're going to be the most important. We're going to focus on them. So if you look at this chart to the left, this basically lays out the 19th century social structure. We've got the aristocracy at the top, and that aristocracy goes back to the concept of nobility. And we have a very small aristocracy that starts to blend in with the very upper middle class. Upper middle classes were people that were investors or they were industrialists, and the aristocracy and upper middle class married into each other to form about 5% of the population. And they're living, they're the upper crust of society. But if we look at the middle classes, and we really have to pluralize that, there is no singular middle class, you can break them into upper, middle, and lower. So like I mentioned, the upper middle class, they're marrying into the aristocracy, and they pretty much have the same lifestyle. The middle classes are still living extremely well. So about 10%, McKay's going to mention, 10% of their annual income just goes to buying meat. 25% of their annual income is about staffing their homes with domestic servants. And then we have this new class, the lower middle class, which comes about because of the creation of new professions that are needed at the time, like architects, accountants, government employees, and maybe they would have a domestic servant, someone that would come during the day, help them make food, help them maintain the home, maybe wouldn't even live with them. And that basically separated one level of the middle class from the next, is how many domestic servants you had and how many you could maintain in your household. But by and large, all members of the middle classes, no matter where you fell, had help in their home from domestic servants. But, it's very different from the modern American middle class. We're talking about less than 20% of the population falls into one of those middle classes. And that means most people, about 4 out of 5 people, fall into the working class with a very wide variety of skills. So the middle classes are more diverse and less unified, and the working classes are even more diverse and even more less unified. And the vast majority of them are living in cities. So by 1900 in Britain, less than 8% of people are doing agricultural work. So there's this massive shift where most workers are living into the cities. And just like with the middle classes, it's not a hard line between each class. So at the high end of the working classes, you have a labor aristocracy, and I'll show you some pictures of them. And they're the people that might manage a factory or be the foreman of a factory. And they wanted to mimic the life of the middle class. And there's blending there. They could afford to have some luxuries of the middle class, probably not domestic servants. And then the rest of the working classes, the majority of the working classes, are either semi-skilled or unskilled. So we have a lot of art and photography that represents the difference between these classes. So here's an image of how the aristocracy blending with the upper middle class might have lived. And basically their world revolved around socialization and dinner parties. This is where we get the invention of the concept of a socialite, for example. Here's another image of how they might have lived at these dinner parties. And these would be happening very frequently, which explains why a lot of their income is going to both food and domestic help. Whereas the middle classes, you can tell from this picture, have a very comfortable life, but a much more conservative lifestyle. We're going to talk a little bit more about child rearing and how that changed at this time, but there's a big focus on children here in this image. And here's another good example of how the average member of the middle class might have lived, taking public transportation, spending time with family, reading the newspaper. They're living a really good life, but it's not necessarily a life where most of their time can be dedicated to leisure. Here's an image of the labor aristocracy, so you can see they're pretty well dressed. This image is also a good one for representing the amount of pride they had. They were very proud to be at the top of the working classes, and as a result, their culture also became very, very conservative because they wanted to mimic the lifestyle of the middle class. And the vast majority of people, the 4 out of 5 people, are still living in poor living conditions with large families still, and they're not saving any money, and they have very little time for leisure. All right, so the fourth issue, very much tied to the third one, is the issue of family and values. So we have seen, especially with the Industrial Revolution chapter, that the new divisions of labor split families apart. It split up husbands from wives, so it gendered the workforce. And it also split up parents from children, which does cause this big problem of what do you do with these children, especially after labor laws are passed that ban very young children from working altogether. So we've got that issue. And the breaking up of the family did lead to concerns about morals and values. So there is this explosion of what would be called vice at the time. You can see from this engraving on the left, this is an engraving about the impacts of gin. And so a lot of upper middle class and middle class members of society associated vice with the working classes, which might have not been that inaccurate because the working classes have a low standard of living. They have very few time for emotional bonds, and so we see the most drinking, gambling, and what we'd call blood sport among the working classes. And another big issue is the explosion of prostitution, which at the time prostitution was legal. And it was sort of something that society accepted. And this is part of a problem with a more gendered society. Even for men of the middle classes, it was sort of expected that they would visit prostitutes at some point in their life. Not regularly, but it was something they would do. And as we know from previous chapters, the women that fell into prostitution, it's something that they're doing out of desperation, and it's not something they're doing as a career. They're doing it in short periods of time when they lose their job or they need to supplement the family income because their husband has lost their job. So this is becoming a bigger problem. So again, there's not a whole lot of legal reforms to this, but society does react. And the reaction might be summarized as the creation of a set of middle-class culture and values. So whereas before it would be the aristocracy or the nobility that would set the standards for how people ought to behave, now in the 19th century, it's middle-class values that do that. So the way the home was constructed and the way leisure time was created was all dictated by middle-class preferences. So here's a good example of how all these classes might live in conjunction with one another. It's kind of a spliced view of a Parisian apartment, where if you look at the first floor and the second floor, the middle floors there, you have this very comfortable life of the upper middle class or middle class spending time with children or relaxing. And then if you look at the lower floors, you might see where domestic help lived, and then at the very upper floors would be floors for people with a lot less money. So these people are living on top of each other, but in a very stratified way. And certainly the middle class is living much better. The middle class, I mentioned, has a lot more leisure, so we start to see a lot of art depicting the leisure time that they had and how they liked to spend their time in public spaces, socializing, dancing, eating, all the things the middle class likes to do today. Religious practice, there is a religious revival going on among the middle classes and the working classes, and this is one of those ways that Christian morality and Christian values became very popularized. However, religious practice is not meaning that people are going to church more. In fact, church attendance and church donations are going down big time. So people are becoming more religious in their daily life, in their personal life, in their values, because they're becoming much more conservative in their values, which we're going to talk about in a second, but they're not going to church any more than they used to, or less than they used to. So there's major changes for marriage, courtship, and sexuality as a result of this. So let's talk about marriage first. We finally have this acceptance that marriage could be this institution that was not an arrangement between families, but was the result of a courtship or a result of romantic love, or what McKay will call companionate marriage. But that doesn't mean that people can just go out and date like they would today. So courtship leading to marriage was something that was highly regulated, especially for young women. So they always needed a chaperone or a parent or somebody with them to make sure that any interaction they had with men was controlled and regulated. And that's all part of these Victorian values that come about. And so Victorian values dictate a lot about this obsession with sexual purity. So this double standard does emerge between the genders, where women were told that they should marry for love and they should love their husbands, and men were told that you marry because you need a wife to have children, and that's the thing you ought to do. So upon entering marriage, it was expected that women would be virgins, and it was also expected that men would not be. And it wasn't necessarily expected that men would be faithful, and that goes back to our conversation about prostitution. So of course that leads to number 4. You get these separate spheres that emerge. This is not the first time we've seen this. This has been emerging since the Industrial Revolution started, but it's becoming much more intense. And because middle class values are the values that all members of society are striving for, if a woman had to work, it was sort of seen as something that she had to be ashamed of, because middle class women did not work. They were at home and spending time with their families and maintaining the household. That, of course, leads to a reaction. We start to see the first feminist movement. And many of the women of the feminist movement were middle class, suffragettes, people that wanted to gain women the right to vote. However, a lot of the feminist movement is also among the working classes. Many working class women were drawn to socialism because socialism is something that the oppressed feel drawn to, so they're working class and they're women. They have a double reason to be drawn to that ideology. And then the last thing we'll talk about here is child rearing. So this basically, because middle class values are setting the tone for society, and because the middle class believes in social mobility, they started to invest a lot in their children. And the way they dressed their children or educated their children became a sign of their status. So they do really become obsessed with making their children the hardest working, best educated possible. And I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to this, that they see their children as sort of the apple of their eye, but also a reflection of their own values. So if their children didn't achieve, they felt it was a reflection on them. And so you get a lot of investment in children, and it was a very loving investment, but I'm sure you know from the child's side that puts a lot of pressure on the child. So here's some art that reflects some of these trends that we've seen. So courtship, for example, they started to glorify romantic courtship leading to marriage. I don't know where their chaperones are. The separate spheres of women, that women in terms of emotional bonds formed more emotional bonds with each other than they necessarily would with their husbands. They'd socialize a lot with each other, especially middle-class women with common leisure time. And we see children also becoming a major focus of art. Children were glorified, the apple of their parents' eye, an object to be loved, and spend a lot of money on them through their education, on their clothes, and things like that. Okay, so our last topic, I'm running out of steam a little bit, but I can do it. So of course we have new cultural and intellectual trends as a result of all these social and political changes. And you might summarize this as the triumph of a scientific worldview. So since the scientific revolution, we started to see that paradigm shift, and now in the 19th century, really the scientific worldview has won out. So it really starts with what's called the Second Scientific Revolution, which describes this burst of industry and discovery in fields like chemistry and thermodynamics. So we have the creation of electricity and also industrialized research and development that comes up with a lot of inventions and technologies to improve people's lives. So that's the major focus of science at this time, as opposed to studying astronomy. There's a big emphasis on biology because of the reaction to public health crises and public health reform movements. And one of the major breakthroughs in biological understanding is Darwin and his theory of natural selection. So he is working off of some previous but flawed theories like Lamarck's about how species evolve over time. But his major contribution is natural selection, that certain positive traits or certain beneficial traits of species are going to survive and be preferred over time, which leads to the changing of species or evolution of species over time. Just like in the United States, this was controversial. It's not as controversial in Europe, but it's changing people's understanding of their place in the universe and their worldview. And of course, it challenges the concepts of creation during this time of religious revival. I think one of the most important breakthroughs in sciences is not in the hard sciences, but what are called the social sciences, which we usually think about sociology and psychology. And sociology is the big one here. So because of this new emphasis on education, there's the growth of all these new universities, and these universities are doing a lot of studies in sociology or understanding this new society that they're living in. So we have some thinkers that become really important, like Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, and their major concern is with, obviously, how the working classes are living. And what they see are these trends towards depression and alienation and this loss of a sense of community, this loss of a sense of morality. And they're trying to explain why those trends are occurring in this new industrialized society. And they have a pretty bleak outlook that society was going to see a lot more of these issues like suicide and depression in the industrial society that they lived in. And of course, that bleakness is reflected in a lot of art and literature. So here we have four important authors at the time: Emile Zola, Leo Tolstoy, Flaubert, and Balzac, who are all writing in the realist genre. And realism is just to try and depict society as realistically as it is, whether that's the middle class or the working class. Many of them did focus on the sort of dark sides of this. So if they were writing about middle class life, they were kind of writing about this new obsession with money. And these difficult relationships between parents and children that were all dependent on money. If they were writing about the working class, they were writing about the problems that they were dealing with and how they coped with lack of emotional bonds and turned to drinking and vice and things like that. When it comes to realism in art, that's exactly what we see, sort of the desire to depict life as it really is. So a big subject area is people at work, people just going about their daily lives, as more and more of life is about working for wages. So here we have this image of a woman working at a bar. She's just doing her work. Or going about their daily lives, walking down the streets. Or a lot of depictions of the working class and how the working class lived in reaction to the middle class. Okay, that covers all the topics in chapter 22. So hopefully now as you read through all these topics, you sort of see the big picture on what the purpose of the chapter is. And also as you're reading more of the details that McKay provides, hopefully it'll stick a little bit better because you see the big picture of the chapter. We are going to do a debate this week. I'm pretty excited about it, actually. I think it's a good idea. Might take some time, but I think it'll be worth it. So I will see you guys. Enjoy your long weekend. I will see you on Tuesday.